Grave of the Fireflies ends up being an anti-war film, but that was not the intention of the director, Isao Takahata, who claimed his intention was to make a movie that delves into disaster situations and how people react to them. In his mind, while working on the film, an anti-war movie had to go into the reasons for why a war starts, while Fireflies only shows the ending days of a war. But on the contrary, it makes quite a good anti-war film for it to be set on civilians instead of soldiers. Other anti-war films I have seen have focused on soldiers in their battles and facing the horridness of war, but it is quite interesting to see the perspective of two children in a war that has come to their home from which they weren't even meant to fight in. While Takahata doesn't go deep into the starting of this war, you do see a lot of hints at it, mainly because I believe that this movie, by showing how it was, is enough to make it an anti-war film, as flames engulf the city and civilians are turned into refugees. A soldier stands up and cries, "Long live the Emperor." In another scene, Seita remarks back to a military celebration, watching his father on one of Japan's warships. The crowd is filled with military fever and nationalism. Seita then mimics a gunner shooting down enemy planes, only to remember that he is in a bomb shelter. This all goes into one of the film's main themes, responsibility. It is prevalent throughout. It strikes at the complexity of wartime and crises. While many films portray crisis with some sort of cool lead that has to take responsibility and be cool and betrays that the rest of the world has become violent animals, this film actually tries to examine how people live in desperate times. People are pushed to the brink, and they can become more selfish and vile, but are not at all heartless. Even the workers at the station are heartless. They have just seen too many children die to process it. When Sato sits against a pillar in the opening of the film, which for some extra sadness in the book it is described the orphans hid under these pillars for it reminded them of their mother's protection, Seita is given food by a passing stranger, who merely sets it beside him and keeps walking. It isn't much, it doesn't save him at this point, nor does it seem he wants to be saved, but in that kindness it shows that humans can show their best in a disaster. The film does its best to portray the unintentional consequences of the character's actions, as Seita is partly responsible for his sister's death, as he cut her off from the ration system, and his aunt is responsible for chastising the kids into leaving and not attempting to stop them going out on their own, and the United States is responsible for dropping incendiary bombs on their city, and Japan is responsible for causing the war. And then does that make the civilians hold part of the responsibility for the support of the war effort? While I say that they were manipulated by a government controlled by the military, the people still supported the war, pushing the country into a feedback loop of coming closer and closer to war. Even up to the bitter end, nationalism was high among many people. But Setsuko, a 4-year-old, can they face blame for the war and be subject to bombing? Even the people who didn't support the war, the average person just wanted to live their everyday lives. Could they see the justification in indiscriminate bombings? When the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are brought up in conversation, one defense for it was Japan's war crimes. While those shouldn't be ignored, it does seem to just be a distraction from the moral question about those bombings, or any other bombing of Japan. But then again, does the United States deserve indiscriminate bombings for its various imperialist actions? So yes, they did bad things, but that doesn't mean the other side did bad things. In reality, maybe we just have to accept that it was a terrible situation, and Japan was a victim as well as a perpetrator. The meaning to take away from this movie is that a lot of people shared responsibility, and all of them were human, and there wasn't just a single bad guy that all this destruction could be placed on. The situation in Japan had been brewing for a long time, from facing racism from the outside world, while at the same time being an imperial power itself, seeking expansion into Asia and being against the white people from taking over Asia for themselves. Meanwhile, people in the military were killing politicians against the war, and Parliament was losing power. With anything, it is imperative to look at the external and internal forces to understand, or attempt to understand. But Takahata's goal for the audience wasn't only to think of the past, but to reevaluate our lives today. The last shot of the film is the ghosts of the two siblings looking out onto the modern skyscrapers of Japan. The interpretations of this shot can vary. from the war haunting Japan to this day, or to a more comforting thought that these spirits still look after us. Or maybe it was, as Takahata would claim, meant to show the younger generation of Japan what the older generation went through and how the war is being forgotten and even misconstrued. Takahata had said that he welcomed other interpretations of the film, so thinking any of these things isn't wrong, and an artist cannot control how the work is seen. But back to the point. With Japan's rapid rebuilding, the war was wiped away. Takahata didn't believe in a demilitarization of Japan. Japan's war guilt disappeared in the mix. Takahata's goal wasn't just to show Japan as an unfortunate victim. He was keen on showing that Japan had supported the war, as I have shown, and how Japan had led to its own destruction. It should be noted that Takahata had seen the war firsthand. He experienced the bombings and recounted it as being one of the worst times in his life. He never wanted to see this happen again. Japan's empire cannot be seen as the height of the country. It was in fact a pretty bad time for those involved. Takahata stated that he didn't think the film could be anti-war, as it didn't delve into the causes of war. He saw the film more as how people react in a crisis situation, and how people need to reevaluate themselves in current society. It's why the film ends on a shot of the siblings overlooking modern-day Japan. The movie, I guess like all movies, was made for the time it was made in. Takahata saw the situation of modern Japan similar to the twilight of the war. People were selfish and isolated, and it was removing what society was about. Takahata delves into this idea in his later works, usually using the countryside and cities to counteract each other, one being of the old times, the countryside, and the city being of our times. However, his messaging isn't as simple as farm life good, city life bad. Takahata had a lot of complexity in his work, so much so that his movies make us think more than just us pulling a message out of it. He still portrays how difficult modern life is for most of us. His films don't boil down to simple messages like a conservative, trust your elders, neither are they the opposite. Takahata seemed to be foremost concerned with just portraying life. The thing to notice in his films is that scenes do not exist only to justify the next scene. They exist on their own. He wanted to show the simple everyday actions of people in order to bring the characters to life. The scenes are by no means meaningless. For example, there is a scene where a group of boys find the shelter the children are living in. The scene doesn't further any plot, they don't cause any damage, but there's still meaning. The boys are interpreted to be like us, the modern people coming across these stories, having no perception of the emotional weight and messing around, not respecting and not understanding what they are stumbling upon. Perhaps showing that no matter how immersive the art, we will never actually be in the movie. I find it a good way to point at us, as we must try and figure out what ourselves are meant to do after being exposed to this, instead of just being like, that was sad. Another scene that further pushes this point is towards the end, after Setsuko's death. A group of girls return to their home and remark how long they have been gone. They look out over the lake where the bomb shelter still stands, the place where Setsuko died, and remark on what a beautiful view it is. We are a detached onlooker, like the rest of society. We can become selfish when detached, or at least distant. The farmer, under fear and pride, beat Seta with anger. He wasn't a bad person. It was just under circumstances that led society to this point. And the cop who saves the kid offers him water, but no food. Takahata wants us to think about this, to look at our circumstances and know that we can't rewind the clock to the past. Or circumstances may have made it easier to be kinder, but we must evaluate the now and think of how we must act now that things have gone through an irreversible change. We all bear responsibility in our world, and we must be conscious of it. The direness of this movie, the violence, isn't just for shock or to make the film cool. It carries that meaning. Essentially, he doesn't want his country of Japan, or any of us, to live selfishly and without thought of it, which may be why none of the characters in the film ever heavily question why circumstances brought them to where they are. They are just trying to survive. This film has a lot of complexities. People may seem uncaring, but it may be that they have nothing left to spare. Saita at one point becomes glad for the air raids because it lets him steal from empty homes so he can sell what he has stolen for money to get food, even though it was an air raid which brought him into this situation. The film depicts the children constantly hearing how people and kids are reuniting with their mothers, adding to their feeling of isolation, and how the incoming planes are treated like a natural disaster. As Takahata intended, the film is meant to show how people react to a disaster. When Saito waits in a line at the bank, hears talk of the typhoons headed towards Japan, which one person asks, why must the divine wind come after the war has ended? Seeing the ghosts of the children see the final days of their lives go by, I especially like seeing Saita's character realize the emotion of key events. We see him covering his ears, trying not to hear his sisters crying as his mother's clothing is taken away, while living Seita saw it as joyful since it was going to get them food. It is heartbreaking how sometimes we can't tell what a situation will really mean until too much time has gone by. I like that this film opens with the end, so we, as the audience, aren't so much distracted by the question of if the children will survive, but we are allowed to focus on how the events led them there. But we still feel all the tension. I like the use of colors. Red isn't used often, but the ghosts of the kids have a red glow, and red is associated with their mother. Lastly, Takahata wanted to show how joy was fleeting. In every scene, there is an underlying fear. Scenes of happiness end with bitter reminders of how short lived it is. When they capture the fireflies to light up their room, it is beautiful. But at the end of the night, they start to drop dead. I suppose, on the other hand, that means times of hardship and sadness end as well. Despite showing that their times of happiness end, it's still important to see that they were happy. It adds a lot to the film, to know that children could be happy, that even in the hardest times they try to live. Maybe we must enjoy our time more, but at the same time be careful not to burden ourselves too hard on trying to enjoy time more and then missing out on that fun time. But maybe it is worth to sing while playing the piano, even if someone's going to stop you and tell you how wrong it is to do that since there's a war going on. Be careful to not let your nationalism hurt others. Maybe we just need the fun. Akiyuki Nosaka lost his younger sister in the war. He admits that he was not like Seita. He hurt his sister, he ate her food. Though she was even younger than Setsuko in the story, he could never forget her death. With Grave of the Fireflies, he tried to reconcile with what had happened when he wrote the story, but he had said he felt as if he died in 1945, and only a ghost of him was living on in the modern world. His and Takahata's experiences must be remembered if we are to try and live now.